Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the Bee's Knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jaw over Unit 5, Day 6. But first, let's do our daily punishment. I'm reading a book about anti-gravity. It's impossible to put down. Science is fake. Key terms for today: the Treaty of Fort Laramie and Atkins, Buffalo Soldiers, the Battle of Little Bighorn, George Armstrong Custer, Exodusters, Chief Joseph, Geronimo, Helen Hunt Jackson, the Sandy Creek Massacre, the Dawes Severalty Act, 59ers, Cattle Trails, Frederick Remington, the Homestead Act, Boomtown, Wounded Knee Massacre, and Carlisle Indian Schools. We're going to go over Native Americans' relationship with the U.S. government during the Gilded Age and the Great Plains Wars. Economic developments during the West during the Gilded Age. And cultural and artistic characteristics of the West. Let's talk about Clash of Cultures. The Treaty of Fort Laramie and Fort Atkinson begin the reservation system in America. That's where the Native Americans will start to be put in reservations in Oklahoma. They'll be forced to concede their ancestral land and live in reservations. There's going to be warfare between the Native Americans and the U.S. Army after the Civil War, even though many of these Native Americans in the Plains were loyal to the U.S., the North, in the Civil War. 1/5 of the U.S. Army soldiers were Buffalo Soldiers, African American veterans that fought for the U.S. Army in the Plains Wars. One of the biggest battles in the Plains Wars was the Battle of Little Bighorn. The colonel in command of the U.S. Army was George Armstrong Custer. He was overconfident with 264 men. He thought there was no way the Native Americans would be able to kill him and destroy him. He was actually offered to use a Gatling gun before the battle to bring it with him. That was like the earliest version of a machine gun. He refused it. He said he didn't need it. He's going to be surrounded by the Sioux and Cheyenne. They'll be led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and they'll massacre all of the U.S. soldiers. So 264 versus 2,500 Native Americans. It's one of the biggest Native American victories, although it is going to make American public opinion outraged. And after this, America is going to start even more forcing the Native Americans into reservations. Here are some Buffalo Soldiers. Let's talk about some of the Native American tribal leaders. You have Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph was betrayed by the American government into thinking they were returning to their ancestral lands in Idaho. Really, they went to the reservations in Kansas. And let's be honest, guys, nobody wants to go to Kansas. 40% of them will die of disease. Chief Joseph will try to escape and try to go to Kansas. Chief Joseph will try to escape and try to go to Canada from Kansas. He'll be caught right before the border, and he'll be stuck back in Kansas. This is where he says he will fight no more. Geronimo was an Apache. He's one of the last Native American fighters against the U.S. government. He fought in New Mexico and Arizona. What's going to happen is the U.S. government is going to, when he's fighting against the U.S. government is going to go to the Apache villages. They're going to take all the women and move them to Florida to exile. They're going to say, we're not going to give them back to you unless you surrender. So really kind of a cheap way of doing things. And he will be forced to surrender. A lot of times railroads will help to defeat Native Americans because troops and supplies were easily moved. Diseases will also kill more Native Americans than the army. And here's a picture of Geronimo. Let's talk about Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book called The Century of Dishonor. This pointed out the terrible treatment of Native Americans. This is a very kind of paternalistic book. It pointed out how badly the Native Americans were treated, how we never followed a treaty with them. But it also kind of said that the Native Americans need to learn like the ways of the whites. So it is kind of paternalistic. It was influenced by Christian reform and Christian education. Some of the Christian reformers that go to the Native Americans were kind of corrupt and they were unethical. Sometimes they would withhold food until Native Americans abandoned their tribal religions. There were some massacres of the Native Americans. One of the first massacres was the Sandy Creek Massacre during the U.S. Civil War. The Sandy Creek Massacre was done by Chivington. They just attacked a whole Native American village for no reason and wiped it all out. This was in Colorado. The Wounded Knee Massacre is another big one that happened during the Gilded Age. The Native Americans were performing a ghost dance, which was a ceremonial dance. It was not meant to be warlike. The army was afraid that the ghost dance would lead to a Native American uprising. So 200 men, women, and children are going to be killed as the army starts firing into the dancers. And here's the ghost dancers. Obviously, this painting is made by an American. It's propaganda. Like, you do not see... this is not how it looked. You don't see Native Americans firing. They're probably, like, dancing and chilling. And the U.S. is like, why is there dead Americans here? Who's shooting you? Like, are you fainting from looking at the dancing? What is going on here? Congress will pass something called the Dawes Severalty Act. This was to monitor and control Native American tribes. Here's what the Dawes Severalty Act did. The Dawes Severalty Act dissolved tribes as legal entities, so no more peace treaties with tribes. It's not like we were following them anyway. It ended tribal ownership of land. It would give individual families 160 acres of land. Native Americans were not given citizenship until 1924, however. During this time, Americans will also start to create Carlisle Indian schools. Carlisle Indian schools will try to teach American assimilation. They'll force Native American kids to dress as Americans, to learn English. So really, the idea with the Dawes Severalty Act and the Carlisle Indian School is forced assimilation and trying to destroy Indian culture, Native American culture. Here's an example of the Carlisle Indian School, and it's sad, man. Let's talk about some of the economic changes in the Great West. You will have mining going on. You'll have 59ers, because gold's going to be discovered in Colorado. Pikes Peakers. There'll be Comstock lode discovered in Nevada after the Civil War. Eventually, corporations will start to replace individual miners. At first, individuals would go with their little pans. They would try to find gold and silver. After a while, the gold and silver was in too far in the ground, so they would have to get heavy machinery, like mining machinery, like drills. An individual person could not buy a drill, so you're going to start to see corporations taking over mining by the Gilded Age. There will be a beef bonanza, baby. Cowboys, Texas. During the Civil War, a lot of the cows will be left like just to gather and to breed. So there'll be a lot of cows and beef after the Civil War. What's going to happen is some Texans are going to start to drive cattle from Texas all the way to railroad stations like Dodge City, Kansas, Abilene, Ogalla, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. Cheyenne's one of the biggest ones. These will become places where like the cows will be loaded and then sent to like Chicago to be slaughtered for beef. A lot of these towns will become big cities. There'll be boomtowns during this time. A lot of the people from Texas will be they'll be following specific trails, and those are called cattle trails. The whole cowboy cattle trail thing only lasts for about like 10, 15 years. But it is a good time in the American West. It's been kind of romanticized, but I actually kind of like it a lot during this time. What's going to happen is some farmers are going to start to use like barbed wire. So like the cowboys just can't have their cattle anywhere. Also, they're going to discover like refrigerator railroad where they could slaughter the cows beforehand. So they don't need to like bring all the cows to like these boomtowns to ship them east. Also, because of overgrazing, overexpansion, it will take its toll on ranchers, and the cowboy era will end by the 1880s. This shows some of the cattle trails. A lot of these towns they stopped at became boomtowns. Let's talk about art. There were some famous painters of the American West. The most famous one was Frederick Remington. He idealized the American Western life and the cowboy. Here are some of his paintings. I really like this one right here. This is the Death of the West. They're putting up barbed wire. Like the whole idea of the cowboys, they could travel anywhere, they can graze. And with the barbed wire, it kind of like symbolically ends the West. It kind of like limits it. Lastly, in 1862, during the Civil War, the Homestead Act will be passed. This provided for 160 acres of land for $30. You have to live for the land for 5 years and improve it. At first, this was not very successful. 160 acres was not very much land in the West. There was not enough water. It wasn't great land. However, there will be some new agricultural irrigation styles that's going to make this successful. They discovered a new type of agriculture called dry farming, which does not require irrigation. There was new types of wheat that were brought from Russia that could resist the cold because the Great Plains is very cold in the winter. They're going to start to build dams. And eventually, people will start settling west because of the Homestead Act and because of these new types of technologies. Some of the people that will settle west are exodusters. Exodusters are African Americans who fled the South and are going to move to Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado. They'll be farmers. Here are some exodusters. All right, kiddos, and that's all I have for you for today. Until next time, deuces, 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 yeah.